Jake Bennett wiped the grease from his hands onto his already filthy coveralls and stared at the blinking red light on his console. 3 years. 3 long years he'd been stuck on Waystation Gamma 9, the universe's most forgotten pit stop on the edge of colonized space. Most days he was lucky if a single cargo hauler stopped by for a fuel top-up. The rest of the time he talked to himself, fixed things that didn't need fixing, and dreamed about earning enough to get back to Earth. The proximity alarm wasn't supposed to go off. Ever. Jake's coffee mug tumbled from his hand as the sirens blasted through the cramped station. He scrambled to the scanner display, expecting maybe a busted satellite or some space debris. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. The ship that limped into range was absolutely massive. It dwarfed every cargo hauler, every military vessel, every piece of hardware Jake had ever laid eyes on. The hull gleamed like polished black glass, covered in intricate golden patterns that seemed to flow and shift as starlight hit them from different angles. It would have been the most beautiful thing Jake had ever seen, except for one small problem. It was dying. Plasma fires erupted along the ship's spine like open wounds. Whole sections of the hull were torn open, venting precious atmosphere into the vacuum of space. Debris trailed behind it like a comet's tail. The ship wasn't flying so much as falling forward, momentum the only thing keeping it moving. Jake's hands flew across the keyboard, pulling up everything his ancient database had on the vessel's design. When the match came back, his stomach dropped. Drackery, he breathed. Everyone knew about the Drackery, even out here in the middle of nowhere. The Dragon People. An empire that had been conquering stars when humans were still banging rocks together. They were powerful, ancient, and they definitely didn't consider humanity worth their time. Humans were bugs to them. Useful bugs sometimes, but bugs nonetheless. The distress beacon hit his communications array like a hammer. It cycled through dozens of languages, none of them standard. But Jake had been fixing ships long enough to recognize the universal sounds of desperation. The automated message kept repeating the same information over and over. Life support critical. Core containment failing. Crew status emergency. Jake pulled up the navigation data. The nearest Drackery rescue fleet was flagged in his system from old merchant reports. 3 weeks away. Minimum. He looked at the failing ship on his screen. The power readings were dropping fast. Real fast. Computer, how long until that core goes critical? Jake asked. The station's ancient AI took its sweet time calculating. Estimated containment breach in 57 minutes. Blast radius will encompass this station. Jake stared at the numbers. 57 minutes. Not 3 weeks. Not 3 days. Not even 3 hours. He could run. The station had an emergency shuttle, barely space-worthy but enough to get him clear of the blast. He could fire up the engines right now and be safely away before anything bad happened. That would be the smart play. The safe play. The play that every regulation and protocol in the book told him to make. Jake looked down at his hands. They were scarred from years of burns, cuts, and close calls. Every mark told a story of fixing something that everyone else said couldn't be fixed. Of making broken things work again through pure stubbornness and creative problem-solving. He thought about whoever was on that ship. Maybe they looked down on humans. Maybe they wouldn't thank him. Maybe they'd be offended that some primitive human even tried to help. But they were still people. Living, breathing people who didn't deserve to die because the cavalry was 3 weeks late. Ah hell, Jake muttered, grabbing his pressure suit from its wall mount. The suit was a patchwork of repairs held together by hope and spare parts. 6 different patches covered holes from 6 different emergencies. The left arm didn't seal quite right, and the helmet's display flickered whenever he turned his head too fast. But it was vacuum-rated, and that's all that mattered. Jake sealed himself in and ran through the checklist from memory. Air supply good for 4 hours. Magnetic boots functioning. Tool belt loaded with everything he might need. Universal override codes programmed into his wrist computer. Every bit of training screamed at him to wait. Wait for proper authorities. Wait for someone qualified. Wait for someone who actually knew what they were doing with alien technology. But waiting meant dying. For him and for everyone on that ship. Jake cycled the airlock and launched himself into the black. The Drackery vessel loomed ahead of him like a dying god, beautiful and terrible all at once. As he crossed the gap using his suit's small thrusters, he could see the damage up close. It wasn't just bad. It was catastrophic. The airlock responded to his override codes after a tense moment. Jake had always been good at making technology do what he wanted, even when it didn't want to cooperate. The door slid open with a hiss and emergency lighting spilled out, painting everything the color of blood. Inside, the corridors stretched out like the throat of some massive beast. Everything was built on a scale meant for creatures twice Jake's size. He pulled himself along using handholds, his magnetic boots clanking against the metal floor. The first stasis pod he passed made him stop cold. Inside was a Dracary crew member, reptilian features frozen in death. Then another. And another. The whole crew gone. Jake's chest tightened. He wasn't just racing against time anymore. He was potentially the only living thing left on this entire ship. Then he found the Queen's chamber. The room was carved entirely from crystal that pulsed with soft light. Monitoring systems surrounded a single medical pod like worshippers around an altar. Inside that pod lay a being that took Jake's breath away. She was massive, easily 9 feet long, with scales that shimmered between deep purple and liquid silver. Her face was distinctly draconic with an elongated snout and elegant horns that curved back like a crown. Wings were folded against her back, and even folded they looked like capes made of living metal. Even unconscious, even dying, she radiated raw power. The core warning blared through the ship's speakers. 8 minutes to containment breach. Jake tore his eyes away from the Queen and ran toward the engine room. 8 minutes to do the impossible. 8 minutes to prove what humans could do when everything was on the line. Jake burst into the engine room and immediately knew he was in over his head. Way over his head. Nothing looked like it was supposed to. Back on Earth, back in trade school, they taught him about engines. Pistons, turbines, plasma cores, fusion reactors. He understood those. He could tear them apart blindfolded and put them back together. But this was something else entirely. The entire room glowed with a soft blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Crystalline structures grew from the walls like frozen lightning, pulsing with energy that made Jake's teeth ache and his fillings buzz. Power didn't flow through cables here. It moved through transparent conduits like liquid starlight, beautiful streams of pure energy that twisted and turned through impossible geometries. Jake pulled out his diagnostic scanner and pointed it at the nearest crystal formation. The readings made no sense. His handheld unit was designed to analyze every known type of power system in human space. Right now, it was having what could only be described as a nervous breakdown. Human. The voice came from everywhere, cold and sharp as broken glass. You contaminate sacred systems with your presence. Leave immediately. Jake spun around looking for the source. Who said that? I am HFY consciousness of this vessel. You are not authorized to access these chambers. Your primitive tools will only cause further damage. Listen, this or whatever your name is, Jake said, his eyes already tracing the damage. Your sacred systems are about to turn into a really big bomb. I've got maybe 7 minutes to stop that from happening. So either help me or shut up and let me work. There was a long pause. Then, reluctantly, core containment failure in section 7 through 12. Cascade reaction has begun. Finally, something useful. Jake moved closer to the core chamber, and immediately the heat hit him like a physical wall. Even through his suit's cooling systems he could feel it. The containment field was flickering, barely holding together. Every few seconds, it would dim and Jake could see the raw energy inside trying to break free. Translation protocols activated, TSS announced, and suddenly the alien symbols floating above each system shifted into standard. Jake could read them now, and what he saw made his heart sink. The Dracary built things like they were creating art. Every system had multiple backups. Those backups had backups. Everything was interconnected, elegant, and sophisticated. It was engineering at its absolute finest. It was also a complete nightmare to repair. Jake could see what had happened. The initial attack had damaged one critical system. That system's failure had triggered automatic responses in 17 other systems. Those systems had tried to compensate, which overloaded their backup systems, which cascaded into more failures. It was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion, except these dominoes were made of exotic matter and could vaporize a space station. Your analysis? Isis asked, and Jake detected something in the AI's voice. Fear maybe. Or the closest thing an artificial consciousness could feel to it. You guys over-engineered this thing, Jake said, already reaching for his tool belt. Too many safety systems, too many redundancies. When one thing breaks, everything tries to fix it at once and they end up fighting each other. Dracary engineering is perfect, TSS protested. Thousands of years of refinement. Yeah, well, it's perfectly exploding right now, so maybe let me try something different. Jake didn't wait for permission. He grabbed a panel and ripped it open, exposing the crystalline circuits underneath. His hands moved on instinct, years of fixing impossible problems taking over. Humans didn't build things perfect. They built things that could be fixed with whatever was lying around. What are you doing? Us's voice rose in alarm as Jake started cutting power lines. Those systems are essential. These systems are fighting each other. Jake severed another connection, watching power readings shift. Sometimes you gotta make things simpler, not more complicated. He shut down 12 systems that THYSS swore were absolutely critical for survival. The AI made sounds that could only be described as electronic horror. But Jake watched the core temperature start to drop. Slowly, but it was dropping. The problem was the burned-out circuits. The crystalline structures that had shattered from overload couldn't just be replaced. Jake didn't have spares. He didn't even know what they were made of. But he had copper wire. Jake ran back to the airlock where he'd left his emergency supply pack. He grabbed every bit of wire he'd brought from the station, along with his plasma cutter. The thing was old, beat up, and held together with electrical tape. By Drackery standards, it was probably a caveman's tool. But it was his caveman's tool, and he knew exactly how it worked. Back in the engine room, Jake started bypassing the destroyed crystalline circuits with plain old copper wire. He welded connections using techniques that would have gotten him laughed out of any proper Drackery engineering facility. Every shortcut he made, every crude patch, made THYSS emit sounds of pure disgust. "This is barbaric," the AI said, watching Jake twist wires together and seal them with quick welds. "This violates every principle of proper engineering." "This is working," Jake corrected, his eyes on the containment readings. The numbers were stabilizing. The countdown was slowing. He grabbed pieces of his station's old coolant system from his pack, stuff he'd brought just in case. Heat sink materials, thermal paste, radiation shielding. He built a makeshift containment patch using cargo plating he'd found in the corridor, welding it directly to the core housing. It was ugly. It was crude. It looked like something a child might build from spare parts. And it was holding. Jake watched the countdown timer. 2 minutes. 1 minute. 30 seconds. The core temperature hit safe levels at 47 seconds. The ship stopped dying. Jake collapsed against the wall, his hands shaking from adrenaline. Through his helmet, he could hear his own ragged breathing. He'd done it. Against every odd, against technology he didn't understand, using nothing but human stubbornness and duct tape engineering, he'd done it. "Impossible," THYSS said quietly. "By all calculations, your methods should have failed." "Yeah, well," Jake managed a tired grin, "we humans are pretty good at doing impossible things." But his victory was short-lived. The diagnostic scanner in his hand showed new problems. The FTL drive was completely dead. Navigation was barely functional. And most concerning of all, the Queen's medical pod was failing. Jake pulled up the readings on the pod. The systems were incredibly complex, far beyond anything he could repair blindly. The Queen needed immediate medical attention, the kind that required access to the ship's secure databases and emergency protocols. Protocols that only she could authorize. Jake stared at the medical pod through the engine room's cameras. He looked at the unconscious Queen, the last survivor of her crew. He thought about all the regulations, all the diplomatic protocols, all the laws about interfering with other species' royalty. Then he thought about what would happen if he did nothing. "Yes," Jake said slowly, "how do I wake her up?" The AI's response was immediate and sharp. "Absolutely forbidden. Awakening the Queen without proper medical support could kill her. Without authorization, it is an act of war." Jake looked at his scanner again. The medical pod had maybe 6 hours left before total failure. "Then I guess we're starting a war," he said and headed back to the Queen's chamber. Jake stood over the medical pod, his finger hovering over the emergency wake protocol. Every instinct screamed that this was a terrible idea. You don't just wake up alien royalty without permission. You definitely don't wake them up when their entire crew is dead and their ship is held together with copper wire and hope. But the alternative was watching her die. He pressed the button. The pod's liquid drained away in seconds. Monitoring systems beeped and chirped as they brought the Queen out of deep stasis. Jake watched her scales shift color, from the dull gray of suspended animation back to vibrant purple and silver. Her chest rose with her first real breath in who knows how long. Then her eyes opened. Jake had seen a lot of things in his 3 years on the station. Meteor showers, solar flares, even a rogue comet once. But he'd never seen anything like Queen Thyra's eyes. They were gold, bright as miniature suns, and they locked onto him with an intensity that made him take a step back. Her claws extended with a metallic sound that echoed through the chamber. Each one was as long as Jake's hand, curved and wickedly sharp. "Easy." Jake threw his hands up, nearly dropping his scanner. "Easy there. I'm not here to hurt you." Your ship was dying. Like really dying. Core breached the whole deal. I'm Jake. I fixed it. Well, I fixed enough of it that we're not a cloud of atoms right now. Thyra didn't move. She lay there in the pod, those golden eyes studying him like a predator sizing up prey. Jake could see her processing information, probably from those fancy implants the Dracari were known for. When she finally spoke, her voice was like thunder rolling across a distant mountain. Deep, powerful, and more than a little angry. You touched royal systems. You accessed chambers forbidden to outsiders. This is an executable offense under Dracari law. Jake felt his stomach drop, but he wasn't about to back down now. Yeah, well, you're welcome for not exploding. I could have just let your ship turn into a fireball, but I figured saving lives was more important than following rules. Thyra's eyes narrowed. For a moment, Jake thought he might have pushed too far. Then something shifted in her expression. Curiosity maybe. Or confusion. She accessed the ship's logs, her eyes moving rapidly as she reviewed the data. Jake watched her face change as she saw what he'd done. The crude repairs. The bypass systems. The copper wire and welded patches that violated every engineering principle her civilization had spent thousands of years perfecting. She saw it all. And she saw that it worked. Show me, Thyra commanded, rising from the pod. She unfolded to her full height, easily 9 feet tall, her scales catching the emergency lights and throwing back rainbow reflections. Her wings spread slightly for balance, and Jake realized he was looking at someone who could probably tear him apart without breaking a sweat. But he wasn't about to let that intimidate him. Sure. Fair warning though, you're not gonna like what you see. He led her to the engine room. Thyra moved through her ship's corridors with natural grace, but Jake could see her noticing the damage. The scorch marks. The dead crew members they passed. Her expression grew harder with each step. In the engine room, she stared at Jake's repairs in silence. The copper wiring. The crude welds. The improvised heat sinks. It was everything her people would consider wrong, and it was keeping her ship alive. Your methods are primitive, she said finally. Yep. They violate fundamental engineering principles. Sure do. They should not function. But they do. Jake tapped one of his patches. See, that's the thing about human engineering. We don't build stuff to be perfect. We build it to work even when everything goes wrong. Especially when everything goes wrong. Over the next 3 days they worked side by side. Thyra granted Jake access to systems he'd never dreamed of touching. Technical manuals written in languages that predated human civilization. Schematics for technology that shouldn't be possible. In return, Jake showed her what humans did best. Improvisation. Creative problem solving. The art of making broken things work with whatever was available. Thyra found herself watching his hands more than the repairs. They were scarred and calloused, marked by years of hard work. Every time she told him something was impossible, that the systems couldn't be compatible, that the solution wouldn't work, he'd just grunt and try anyway. And somehow it would work. Your people are stubborn, Thyra observed on the 3rd day, watching Jake somehow splice together 2 power systems that her own engineers would have sworn were incompatible. We prefer the term persistent, Jake replied, not looking up from his work. His tongue stuck out slightly in concentration. When you're always the underdog, always facing things bigger and stronger and more advanced than you can't afford to quit. You just gotta keep trying until something works. Thyra tilted her head. An interesting philosophy. It's kept us alive this long. By the end of the 3rd day, Jake had performed a miracle. The FTL drive was working. Not well and not at full capacity, but 30% power was enough. Enough to limp into Dracari space. Enough to get help. Enough to save her life. Thyra stood in the command center looking at the star charts. Then she turned to Jake with an expression he couldn't quite read. Jake Bennett, she said, her voice taking on a formal tone that made the air feel heavier. By the ancient laws of my people, I invoke Crescenel. The life debt. Jake looked up from the navigation console, a grin spreading across his face. Finally they were getting to the good part. The reward. Maybe enough credits to fix up his station, buy some decent equipment. Maybe even enough to get back to Earth in style. So, like a reward? That's awesome. I mean, enough to fix my station would be great. Maybe upgrade the... You misunderstand, Thyra interrupted, and something in her tone made Jake's smile fade. Under Crescenel you are now bound to my household. You are my scale guardian. This bond is for life. Jake's smile vanished completely. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Wait, what? Jake was still trying to wrap his head around the whole life debt situation when every alarm on the ship started screaming at once. His first thought was that something else had broken. His second thought, when he saw Thyra's expression, was much worse. 6 massive warships materialized out of nowhere, dropping out of FTL in perfect formation around them. They were sleek, deadly, and their weapons were already powering up. Jake's scanner lit up like a Christmas tree, showing targeting locks from every direction. "Oh no," Jake said, his throat suddenly dry. "Please tell me that's rescue." He looked at Thyra's face and got his answer. Her scales had darkened, her claws were extended, and her whole body had gone rigid with tension. "That's not rescue, is it?" Jake asked, though he already knew. "Separatists," Thyra said, her voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "They orchestrated the first attack. They murdered my crew. And now they've come to finish what they started." The communication came through on all channels, impossible to ignore. The voice was smooth, confident, dripping with arrogance. "Queen Thyra, we know you're alive. We know your ship is crippled. Surrender yourself now and we'll make it quick. You have 1 cycle to comply." Jake's hands were already moving across the controls, pulling up system reports. Shields at 12% and dropping. Weapons completely offline. Life support barely functional. The FTL drive he'd just gotten working could maybe manage 1 jump, but it would take 20 minutes to charge and they'd be blown apart in 5. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and flying a ship held together with improvised repairs and sheer willpower. Jake said to the AI, his mind already racing through possibilities. "How much power can you divert from shields to engines?" "That course of action is inadvisable," THOSS responded immediately. "Shield failure would leave us completely vulnerable to weapons fire." "The shields are failing anyway," Jake shot back. "They're not gonna stop a full assault from 6 warships. How much power can the engines handle?" There was a pause. "Engines could reach 40% capacity. But without shields, any impact would." "Yeah, I know." Jake was already pulling up a map of the area. His station. The enemy ships. The debris field. The fuel pods he'd left floating in space. Thyra moved beside him, watching what he was doing. "This is suicide. We cannot fight 6 warships." "You're right," Jake agreed. "We can't fight them. But I'm not planning to fight them." "Then what are you planning?" Jake looked at her, and despite everything, despite the terror making his hands shake, he grinned. "Something really, really stupid." "Your people," Thyra said, and there was something in her voice. Not quite hope, but maybe the possibility of hope. "Are absolutely insane." "Yeah, well," Jake said, his fingers flying across the controls, "humans are real good at the whole insane desperation thing. It's kind of our specialty." He opened a channel back to his station's computer. Good old Waystation Gamma 9, his home for 3 years. The place was a dump, held together with duct tape and prayers, but right now it was the most valuable thing in the universe. Because it was full of mining equipment. Jake remotely activated every mining charge on the station. Dozens of them, meant for breaking apart asteroids. He set them to proximity detonation and launched them into space, scattered across the area in what looked like random patterns. But it wasn't random. Jake knew exactly where he was putting each one. Next came the fuel pods. Old, outdated, the kind that leaked and needed constant maintenance. Jake had been meaning to replace them for years but never had the budget. Now he set them to vent their contents on his command, positioning them throughout the debris field. "What are you doing?" Thyra asked, watching his preparations. "Making a minefield," Jake said. "Sort of." "Yes, start charging the FTL drive, but don't tell me when it's ready. I need them to think we're dead in the water." The Separatist ships were moving closer now, weapons hot, forming a tighter net around them. Jake watched their approach on the scanner. They were being careful, professional. They probably thought this would be easy. They had no idea what was coming. "All power to engines," Jake commanded. "Everything. Shields, life support, everything except critical systems. I need every bit of speed we can get." "Jake Bennett," Thyra said quietly. "If this fails?" "If this fails, we were dead anyway," Jake interrupted. "But it's not gonna fail. I hope." The lead ship fired a warning shot that splashed against their failing shields. The whole ship shuddered. "Now or never," Jake muttered. He opened the channel to the enemy fleet. "Hey there. This is Jake Bennett, acting captain of this vessel. I've got a message for you." "The human speaks," the Separatist commander laughed. "Your pet has spirit, Thyra. But it won't save." Jake cut him off. "The message is, learn to duck." He triggered everything at once. The mining charges detonated in sequence, creating a cascading wall of explosions. The fuel pods vented their contents, and Jake fired the ship's emergency thrusters to ignite the cloud. Suddenly, the space around them turned into a storm of fire and shrapnel. But Jake wasn't done. He remotely triggered his station's emergency venting system. Decades of stored atmosphere, millions of cubic feet of air, screamed into space all at once. The pressure was enormous, uncontrolled, and Jake aimed it like a weapon. The escaping air slammed into Thyra's ship, pushing it forward. Jake fired the engines at full burn, adding to the momentum. They weren't flying anymore. They were falling forward, picking up speed, straight toward the enemy flagship. Collision alert. HFY screamed. Impact in 15 seconds. I know. Jake yelled back, hands locked on the controls. The Separatist ships tried to scatter, but they'd moved in too close. The debris field Jake created blocked their escape routes. They had seconds to react, and it wasn't enough. Thyra's ship, pushed by escaping atmosphere and burning engines, slammed into the flagship at sublight speed. The impact wasn't elegant. It wasn't precise. It was brutal, catastrophic, and completely insane. Both ships survived. Barely. Metal screamed, hull plating tore like paper, and Jake felt his whole body slam against the restraints hard enough to bruise. The flagship spun away, crippled and venting atmosphere. The remaining Separatist ships, faced with an opponent crazy enough to weaponize literally everything including his own home, made the smart choice. They ran. Jake floated in the ruined command center, his ears ringing, his whole body aching. Through the cracked viewport, he watched the enemy ships jump to FTL, fleeing as fast as their drives could carry them. Did we win? He asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Thyra was standing beside him, scales scorched but otherwise unharmed. She stared at him with those golden eyes, and slowly, very slowly, she started to laugh. Your people, she said, are absolutely insane. Jake coughed, tasting blood. We prefer innovative. 2 weeks had passed since that wild emergency landing, and Jake found himself in a situation he never could have imagined. He was standing in the grand hall of the Dracary Council, looking up at 12 massive thrones that seemed to be made of frozen starlight. Each throne held a matriarch, and all 12 pairs of eyes were locked onto him. The weight of their stare felt like it could flatten him into the floor. Jake shifted his weight nervously. He was the first human to ever stand here. The first human these alien queens had even bothered to meet face to face. That thought didn't exactly calm his nerves. Queen Thyra stood beside him, tall and regal as always. She began speaking to the council in that smooth, commanding voice of hers. She told them everything. How the ship had been failing. How Jake had climbed into places her own engineers wouldn't go. How he'd rigged together solutions that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. And most importantly, how he'd risked his own life without hesitation to save hers. The matriarchs listened in silence. When Thyra finished, one of them leaned forward on her throne. Her scales shimmered like polished bronze. The human is crude, she said flatly. His methods are primitive. Jake felt his stomach drop. Great. They thought he was a caveman with a toolbox. But another matriarch spoke up, her voice thoughtful. The human is effective. Our systems failed. His did not. A third matriarch, older than the others with scales that had faded to silver, added something that made Jake's blood run cold. The human is dangerous. Imagine if their kind learned our technology and combined it with their chaotic approach. The room went quiet. Jake could feel his future hanging by a thread. Then Thyra's voice cut through the tension like a blade. The human saved my life when he had absolutely no reason to do so. He could have escaped in the pod. He could have left me to die. Instead, he saw a person in trouble. Not a political opportunity. Not a chance to gain favor. Just someone who needed help. That quality is worth more than all our carefully designed systems and protocols. She turned to face Jake directly, and her expression softened just slightly. I will honor the life debt in full. You will serve as my consort guardian, with all the privileges and protections that title carries. Jake's brain stuttered to a halt. Consort? That sounded dangerously close to, wait, were they talking about marriage? His face must have shown his panic because he saw the faintest hint of amusement flicker across Thyra's features. Before he could say anything stupid, she continued. Additionally, I propose something unprecedented. An exchange program. Let us bring human engineers into our space. Let them work alongside our people. Let them show us what we have forgotten in our centuries of pursuing perfection. Sometimes broken things do not need elegant solutions. Sometimes they need creative ones. Messy ones. Human ones. The council chamber erupted into discussion. Some matriarchs looked intrigued. Others looked horrified at the idea of humans poking around their pristine star systems. The debate went on for hours. Jake stood there the whole time trying not to fidget, while these powerful beings argued about humanity's fate. Finally, the eldest matriarch raised one clawed hand. Silence fell instantly. She looked ancient, her scales almost white with age, but her eyes were sharp as lasers. Humanity will be granted provisional status as technical consultants to the Dracari Empire. You, Jake Bennett, will serve as our liaison between our peoples. Jake blinked. What exactly does that mean? Thyra looked at him, and this time there was definitely amusement in her voice. It means you are going to teach my people the human way of doing things. Starting tomorrow morning. Jake thought about that for a moment. Then he grinned. You're going to regret this. Perhaps, Thyra said. But it will be interesting. 6 months flew by faster than Jake expected. Now he found himself standing in the engine room of Thyra's completely rebuilt flagship. It was gorgeous. Slick. Perfect. Everything gleaming and humming with quiet efficiency. And arranged in front of him were 20 Dracari engineers, all watching him with expressions that clearly said they thought this whole exercise was beneath them. Jake had set up a teaching board behind him. On it, in big letters, he'd written a phrase that had gotten him through countless repair jobs back home. If it is stupid but it works, it is not stupid. The Dracari engineers stared at the words like they were written in an alien language. Which Jake supposed they kind of were. All right everyone, Jake announced, picking up a heavy wrench from his toolkit. Today's lesson is about something we humans call percussive maintenance. One of the engineers, a younger male with bright green scales, raised his hand. What is percussive maintenance? Jake grinned. Watch and learn. He walked over to a power relay that had been sputtering and flickering for the past 10 minutes. The Dracari engineers had been running diagnostics, checking calibrations, preparing to disassemble the whole unit to find the microscopic flaw in its design. Jake raised the wrench and smacked the relay firmly on its side. The sputtering stopped. The relay hummed to life, glowing steadily. 20 Dracari engineers stared in absolute horror. One of them made a sound like a strangled gasp. Another looked like she might faint. Sometimes, Jake explained, setting down the wrench, a component just needs a little encouragement. Get stuck. Needs to be reminded to do its job. You can spend hours running tests or you can try the quick fix first. That is barbaric, one engineer whispered. That is efficient, Jake countered. Did it work? No one could argue with that. From the doorway Jake caught movement. Queen Thyra had been watching the whole lesson. She stood there in her full royal armor, arms crossed, her expression completely unreadable. Jake felt a moment of panic. Had he gone too far? Was she regretting her decision to bring humans into her perfect empire? Then something happened that Jake had never seen before. Something that made every engineer in the room freeze. Queen Thyra laughed. It started as a quiet sound, almost like she was surprised by it herself. Then it grew into genuine laughter, rich and warm and completely unqueen-like. 6 months ago, she said, walking into the room, I would have had you thrown into space for treating equipment that way. Now I am beginning to understand. She looked at her engineers, who still seemed to be processing what they'd witnessed. Sometimes perfection is the enemy of function. Sometimes good enough is better than flawless. These are lessons we forgot long ago. She turned back to Jake. Continue the class, Consort Guardian. I believe my people have much to learn. Jake watched her leave, then turned back to his students. They were looking at him differently now. Not with respect exactly, but with curiosity. With the first hints of understanding. All right, he said, rolling up his sleeves. Who wants to learn about duct tape?